My father and brother mocked me when I didn't let them throw Grandpa's inheritance in the trash. Welcome to Ravenna, Ohio, 2024. Sounded fancy when I said it like that, but trust me, it was anything but. This place was stuck in a weird time loop. Modern year on the calendar, but the soul of the town was still partying like it was 1985. Our main street had these old neon signs that flickered when it rained, and there was always some classic rock blasting from somebody's beaten-up Chevy. The one comic book store downtown still had those faded Tim Burton Batman posters in the window, right next to the newer Marvel stuff. When summer hit, and everyone mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings, the whole town smelled like fresh-cut grass and nostalgia. That's where I lived, or survived, depending on how you looked at it. I'm Jake Martin, 18 years old, skinny as a rail, and usually sporting my faded Spider-Man shirt that had seen better days. Most days you'd find me at the Shell station on Route 14, pumping gas and stocking snacks for minimum wage plus whatever tips people threw my way when I cleaned their windshields. 3 nights a week. I also hauled boxes at the Amazon warehouse outside town. Not glamorous, but every dollar got me closer to maybe affording community college next fall. My parents, Bill and Marge Martin, lifelong Ravenna residents, and the proudest football parents you'd ever seen. Not for me, though. For my brother Kyle. Kyle was 21, built like a linebacker, which he was in high school, with this perfect white smile that looked like it belonged in a toothpaste commercial. He got a partial football scholarship to Ohio State, and my parents acted like he'd already been drafted to the NFL. Every spare penny they had went into his apartment, his meal plan, his training equipment. When he came home for the weekend, it was like the king had returned to his castle. Meanwhile, I was the other kid, the skinny one who read too many comics and couldn't throw a spiral to save his life. I'd heard, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" So many times I could make a bingo card out of it, and I'd probably fill the whole thing before dinner. Last month, when I asked about help with community college applications, Dad just shrugged and said, "Jake, you know we're stretched thin with Kyle's tuition. You're smart. Figure something out." Mom nodded along while folding Kyle's OSU sweatshirts. That's when I realized I was completely on my own. Their words hit like a sucker punch, but I just nodded, swallowed my pride, and picked up extra shifts at the Shell station. The thing was, I'd always been on my own in this family. When Kyle was winning state championships, I was in the bleachers sketching Spider-Man in my notebook. When my parents were driving 6 hours to watch Kyle's games, I was biking across town to my one real sanctuary, Grandpa Fred's house. Grandpa Fred, or just Gramps as I called him, was the coolest 78-year-old you'd ever meet. He lived in this small house at the edge of town that looked ordinary from the outside, but step inside and you were in comic book heaven. Every shelf, table, and most of the floor space was covered with carefully preserved comics from every era. X-Men, Superman, Fantastic Four, obscure indie titles from the 60s that nobody had heard of. He had them all. His wife, my grandma Ellie, passed 5 years ago, but he still talked about how they read Batman comics together when they were dating in the 50s. Some of my earliest memories were sitting on his porch swing with Gramps and Grandma, sipping homemade lemonade while they took turns doing different voices for all the characters in Detective Comics. Comics aren't just paper and ink, Jake. Gramps always told me, they're dreams that teach you to be stronger than your fears. Every superhero has a regular person inside. That's what makes their stories matter. Those afternoons at Gramps' house kept me sane growing up. When my parents were at Kyle's football practice, Gramps was teaching me how to spot a first edition or the differences between Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko's art styles. While Kyle was learning how to tackle, I was learning about storytelling and art and what it meant to stand up for something. Gramps got it. He never asked why I couldn't throw a football or make the honor roll. He just handed me another comic and said, "This one's at heart, Jake, like you." Last Sunday was Kyle's birthday dinner. Mom made his favorite meatloaf, and everyone gathered around our dining table. Aunts, uncles, my parents, and me. I spent 3 hours listening to everyone talk about Kyle's latest game, his girlfriend, his chances at starting next season. Dad kept showing everyone pictures on his phone, bragging about Kyle's workout routine. Mom nudged me halfway through dessert and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, If only you'd be more like your brother, Jake. You could have a bright future, too. I just forced a smile and shoved another forkful of cake in my mouth. What else could I do? On Monday, I was back at the Shell station, sketching Superman in my notebook during a slow afternoon. This regular customer, old guy who drove a classic Mustang, peered over the counter at my drawing. "What, you gonna save us from these gas prices, kid?" He laughed. "Even Superman can't afford premium these days." I shot back, and he actually laughed for real before handing me an extra $1 with his payment. Small victories, I guess. Later that night, I was telling Gramps about it while helping him organize his newest acquisitions. He nodded thoughtfully while carefully sliding an X-Men issue into a protective sleeve. "You know, Jake, heroes in comics aren't the ones who hit the hardest," he said. "The real heroes are the ones who keep getting up after they're knocked down. Remember that Captain America issue where he stands up to Thanos even though he's outmatched? That's courage." I thought about that a lot on my bike ride home. Maybe I wasn't a football star, but I was working 2 jobs, keeping my grades decent, and saving for college. That counted for something, right? Wednesday night was another family dinner. This one to celebrate Kyle's midterm grades, all passes, barely, but my parents acted like he cured cancer. Dad disappeared halfway through and came back with his small box wrapped in shiny paper. Kyle opened it, and inside were keys to Dad's old Jeep Cherokee. "You've earned it, son," Dad said, clapping Kyle on the shoulder. "Can't have our star athlete taking the bus." I stared down at my potatoes, feeling something twist in my stomach. I'd been saving for 6 months just to fix up an old bicycle I found at a yard sale. "Hey, what about me?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. "I turn 18 next week. Maybe I could get, I don't know, a bicycle at least." The table went quiet. Dad looked at me like I'd asked for a mansion in Beverly Hills. "You want something, Jake? Earn it yourself. That's how the real world works." I felt my face burning as Kyle dangled his new keys, making them jingle. Everyone else quickly changed the subject, but I couldn't breathe. I mumbled something about homework and bolted from the table, nearly knocking over my chair. I didn't stop running until I reached the old oak tree behind our high school football field. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even when escaping, I ended up at a football field. The stars were out, bright pinpricks in the Ohio sky. I tilted my head back and whispered to no one in particular, "I'll prove I'm worth something. Just wait." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed flipping through an old Spider-Man comic Gramps had given me years ago, the one where Peter Parker decides to stop feeling sorry for himself and make something of his life. The pages were worn from countless readings, but the message still hit home. Maybe it was time for me to stop living in Kyle's shadow and write my own story. The next morning, I woke up with the Spider-Man comic still open on my chest. Something had changed inside me overnight. Call it determination, desperation, or just plain stubbornness. But I knew I couldn't keep living under my parents' roof where I was treated like an afterthought while Kyle got the royal treatment. I waited until both my parents left for work, then packed everything I care about into my beat-up backpack. A few T-shirts, my sketchbook, some toiletries, and of course, my favorite comics. It wasn't much, but then again, neither was my room in this house. I scribbled a note saying I was moving out and left it on the kitchen table. They probably wouldn't notice I was gone until dinner anyway. By noon, I had rented a small room above Romano's Pizzeria on 3rd Street. The whole place smelled like cheese and marinara sauce, with undertones of the decades-old wooden floorboards that creaked whenever I took a step. The room was tiny, just enough space for a twin bed, a desk, and a wobbly dresser. But it was mine. No Kyle, no trophies, no constant reminders of how I didn't measure up. Mrs. Romano, the 60-something owner, gave me a discount when I offered to help with deliveries on weekends. "You remind me of my nephew," she said, her Italian accent still thick after 40 years in Ohio. Skinny but strong heart. That afternoon, I lined up a 3rd job, night janitor at the medical office complex near the highway. The work was mind-numbing. Mopping floors, emptying trash cans, cleaning toilet from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., but it paid cash under the table. Between that, the gas station, and helping at the pizzeria, I could just barely afford my room and save a little for community college. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. 4 hours a night became my new normal, catching naps during breaks at the Shell station. My eyes had permanent dark circles, and I drank so much black coffee that my hands had a constant slight tremor. One Wednesday afternoon, I was dragging a car of groceries across the parking lot for Mrs. Glover, an elderly neighbor who lived in the apartment building next to Romano's. The temperature was pushing 90 degrees, and sweat was pouring down my back, but I kept a smile plastered on my face as I hauled her cat litter and can soup up 3 flights of stairs. "You're such a good boy, Jake," she wheezed, fishing around in her coin purse. "Let me give you something for your trouble." I wave her off. "No need, Mrs. G. Superman would be jealous of this workout, even if I don't have a cape." She cackled and patted my cheek with her paper-thin hand. "Honey, you don't need a cape. Those muscles you're building will do just fine." She insisted on giving me a homemade brownie wrapped in wax paper, which I devoured in 2 bites on my way back downstairs. Small kindnesses like that kept me going through the exhaustion. By the 3rd week on my own, I had a routine down. The Shell station from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., deliveries for Romano's until 10:30, then cleaning offices until 3 a.m. Collapse into bed, wake up, repeat. My bank account was growing painfully slowly, but it was growing. My parents called once, mostly to ask why I wasn't contributing to the household anymore. When I explained I'd moved out, Mom sounded more confused and concerned. Dad just grunted something about learning responsibility the hard way. Before hanging up, the bright spot of my week was always Sunday, my only day off, and the day I rode my patched-up bicycle across town to visit Gramps. I'd stop at Wilson's comic shop on the way and pick up whatever new Avengers or Batman issues had come out that week, spending some of my precious savings because I couldn't bear to show up empty-handed. Those Sundays on Gramps' porch were what kept me sane. We'd sit in the old wicker chairs, drinking Coke from glass bottles like he'd done since the 1950s, flipping through comics and talking about everything and nothing. The wooden porch swing creaked in the breeze, and sometimes hours would pass without either of us saying anything important, but somehow I felt more understood in that silence than anywhere else. "You look thin," Gramps noticed one Sunday, sliding an extra sandwich my way. "Working too hard and eating too little." I shrugged, trying to look casual. "Gotta hustle if I want to make it to college next year." Gramps wasn't buying it. His eyes, still sharp behind thick glasses, studied my face too carefully. "Your mom called," he said finally. "Seemed surprised you moved out. Said you left without warning." I snorted, feeling a flare of resentment. They hardly noticed I lived there in the first place. Why would they care when I left? Gramps didn't push. Instead, he pulled out a yellowed comic from beside his chair, an original Fantastic Four from 1963. The pages were delicate, the colors still vibrant despite decades of careful handling. "Did I ever tell you how I used to buy these?" he asked, carefully turning a page. "Back in the 50s, comics were just a dime. But my mother thought they were trash, rot my brain, she'd say. So I'd save up my lunch money, go hungry at school, and sneak to the drugstore to buy them. Had to hide them under my mattress like they were dirty magazines." He chuckled at the memory, running his finger along the edge of the page. "Life's like a comic book, Jake. Sometimes you're the hero, sometimes you're just reading along. But you always get to choose which character you want to be, no matter what others expect from you." I let his words sink in, feeling something loosen in my chest for the first time in weeks. "How's the apartment?" he asked, changing subjects. "Small. Smells like pepperoni all the time. But it's mine." Gramps nodded approvingly. Independence has a particular smell. Not always pleasant, but always yours. That made me laugh. A real laugh, not the forced chuckles I'd been giving customers at the Shell station. Gramps always knew how to put things in perspective. As the summer heat began to fade into fall, the routine of my 3 jobs was wearing me down. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. The night manager at the medical building found me asleep once, slumped against a mop bucket, and gave me a warning. I started taking caffeine pills to stay awake, chasing them with energy drinks that made my heart race. One particularly rough day, I complained to Gramps about everything. My exhaustion, my parents' indifference, the futility of trying to save for college while barely keeping my head above water. He listened quietly, letting me vent. When I finally ran out of steam, he handed me a Captain America comic, the one where Cap stand alone against impossible odds. Your strength isn't in your muscles, Jake. It's in here, he said, tapping my chest lightly. Comics teach us that heroes grow from pain. Without the struggle, Captain America would just be a guy in a silly outfit. I smiled despite myself. Speaking of silly outfits, I must look like a disaster right now. Gramps laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You work like the Flash, but look like his cousin after running a marathon. All speed, no style. That became our running joke. Whenever I showed up looking particularly ragged, he'd shake his head and mutter, Flash's cousin, under his breath, and we'd both crack up. October brought colder weather and a small raise at the Shell station. I splurged on a used space heater for my apartment, where the ancient radiator clanked but produced minimal heat. Mrs. Romano started sending leftover pizza up with me after shifts, insisting I was too skinny for an American boy. Between her feeding me and Gramps slipping me sandwiches, I managed to stop losing weight. On my birthday, Gramps gave me an X-Men comic from the 80s. Not particularly valuable, but featuring a story about finding family among strangers that hit close to home. Inside the cover, he'd written, You're stronger than you think, Jake. Keep standing up. That night, I trudged back to my apartment, clutching the comic like a lifeline. My room was cold, my muscles ached from mopping floors all night, and I had to be at the Shell station in 4 hours. But somehow, Gramps' words made the struggle bearable. I carefully placed the X-Men comic on my makeshift nightstand, a stack of milk crates, and collapsed on my bed without even taking off my shoes. I was just drifting off when my phone rang. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. Normally I'd ignore it, but something made me answer. Hello, I mumbled, voice thick with almost sleep. Is this Jake Martin? The voice was professional, clinical. Yeah, that's me. This is Nurse Wilkins from Ravenna Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about Frederick Martin. He's been admitted and gave us your number as his emergency contact. I sat bolt upright, sleep forgotten. My grandfather? What happened? Is he okay? He's stable for now. He had a mild heart attack earlier this evening. The doctor would like to speak with you when you can come in. My own heart felt like it might stop. Gramps, the one person who believed in me, my anchor in a world that barely noticed me, was in the hospital. I promised the nurse I'd be there as soon as possible, then grabbed my jacket and ran out into the cold October night, my exhaustion completely forgotten. All I could think as I pedaled my bike through the dark streets was, not him. Please, not him. I couldn't lose the only person who saw me, really saw me, for who I was. I burst through the hospital doors with my heart hammering against my ribs. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unreal as I stumbled up to the front desk, still catching my breath from a bike ride. Frederick Martin, I gasped to the nurse. I'm his grandson. She directed me to the 3rd floor, cardiac wing. The elevator ride was the longest 30 seconds of my life, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. When the doors finally opened, I practically ran to his room. Gramps looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and clear plastic tubes. His skin had a grayish tone that scared me, but when he saw me, his eyes lit up with that familiar spark. There's my comic book buddy, he said, his voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. I tried to smile, but my face wouldn't cooperate. Scare me half to death, Gramps. What happened? He waved his hand dismissively, the 4 tubes swaying with the movement, just the ticker giving me trouble. Doctor says it was a mild one. I'll be back home reading Batman in no time. But something in his eyes told me he didn't quite believe that, even if he wanted me to. I pulled up the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed and reached into my backpack. I brought reinforcements, I said, pulling out the latest Fantastic for issue I'd been saving for our Sunday read. For the next few hours, I read to him like he used to read to me when I was little. I did all the voices, stretching my words as Mr. Fantastic. Growling as a thing, Gramps smiled weakly, occasionally closing his eyes, but always asking me to continue when I paused to check if he was still awake. The night nurse tried to shoo me away when visiting hours ended, but Gramps held onto my wrist. "He's staying," he told her with surprising firmness. "He's my hero." Something about the way he said it made my throat tighten. The nurse must have understood because she nodded and left us alone. I kept reading even after Gramps fell asleep, the comic book pages illuminated by the dim light above his bed. I was afraid to stop, as if the stories were somehow keeping him tethered to this world. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to a hand gently shaking my shoulder. It was just past dawn, and a doctor with tired eyes was standing over me. "Your grandfather's condition has stabilized, but we'd like to run some more tests," she explained. "Maybe you could get some breakfast and come back in a few hours?" I reluctantly agreed, promised Gramps I'd return with donuts from his favorite bakery, and headed out into the morning light. The world seemed strangely normal. People driving to work, joggers on the sidewalk, a garbage truck making its rounds, while my world felt like it was hanging by a thread. When I returned with a box of maple glazed donuts, Gramps' favorite, the room was empty. A nurse explained they'd taken him for tests and directed me to a waiting area. I sat there for what felt like forever, the donut box growing cold on my lap. The tests turned into more tests. Days turned into a week. I juggled my jobs, catching naps in the hospital waiting room, showering in the employee locker room at the gas station. I read every comic in Graham's collection to him, spinning stories of heroism and hope while the machines around him beeped steadily. Some days were better than others. On good days, we'd talk about the comics, and he'd tell me stories about buying his first Superman issue, or how he'd met my grandmother at a sci-fi convention in 1965. On bad days, he'd just listen, his eyes closed but his hands squeezing mine when something in the story moved him. My parents visited exactly once. They stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, made small talk for 15 minutes, then left with promises to return that we all knew were empty. Kyle didn't come at all. It happened on a Tuesday night. I was reading Gramps' The Original Fantastic for #1, the issue where the team first gets their powers. His breathing had been more labored than usual, but he insisted I continue. I was halfway through when I realized the pressure of his hand in mine had changed. I looked up from the page to find his eyes closed, his chest still. I don't remember dropping the comic. I don't remember hitting the call button or the nurses rushing in. I just remember the terrible stillness that followed, the final beep of the heart monitor stretching into a continuous tone before someone switched it off. They let me stay with him a while longer. I held his cooling hand and whispered, "You were my Superman, Gramps," as tears dropped onto the comic book splayed across his blanket. The next few days passed in a blur. There were funeral arrangements to be made, paperwork to sign. I moved through it all like a zombie, taking time off from my jobs only because I had to. My boss at the Shell station was surprisingly understanding, telling me to take the week and my job would still be there. Mrs. Romano brought food to my apartment that I couldn't eat. The funeral was small, a few of Gramps' old friends from the VFW, some neighbors, me, and my parents. Kyle sent flowers but couldn't make it back from college for an important practice. The pastor said nice things about a man he'd never met, and then it was over. Gramps was gone. A week later, I received a call from a lawyer. The reading of the will was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I took off work early, put on the only decent shirt I owned, and biked to the small law office downtown. Dad was already there when I arrived, Mom beside him looking uncomfortable in her church dress. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, was a balding man with kind eyes who had apparently handled Gramps' affairs for decades. Frederick was very specific about his wishes, Mr. Peterson explained, adjusting his glasses to read from the document. The house and property at 1423 Elm Street go to his son, William Martin. Dad nodded, unsurprised. It was the expected outcome. Son inherits father's house. I hadn't expected anything different. To my grandson, Jacob Martin, the lawyer continued, I leave my fishing tackle, my woodworking tools, and my collection of books. That was it. I wasn't disappointed. I hadn't expected anything, but I was surprised Gramps hadn't mentioned his comics. They were his most prized possessions. What about his comic books? I asked. Mr. Peterson checked his papers. No specific mention. They would be considered part of the household contents, which go with the property. Dad was already standing, ready to leave. We'll be clearing out the house this weekend. If you want to come get your things, he said, not quite looking at me. That Saturday, I biked to Gramps' house with an empty backpack and a hollow feeling in my chest. The place already felt different, colder, emptier without a minute. Mom was sorting through kitchen cabinets while Dad was in the garage making piles for donation. I found my inherited fishing rod and toolkit easily enough. They didn't take up much space in my backpack, but they weighed a ton in terms of memories. Summers at the lake with Gramps teaching me to cast a line, winters in his workshop learning to build birdhouses and repair broken furniture. I was about to leave when I spotted Dad dragging a large cardboard box across the living room toward the front door. Through the open flaps, I could see the corner of a plastic-covered comic book. What are you doing with those? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Dad barely glanced at me. Junk for the curb. The donation center doesn't want old magazines. My blood ran cold. Those aren't junk. Those are Gramps' comics. His collection. His life. They're taking up space, Dad grunted, continuing to drag the box. Nobody wants this stuff. Kyle, who had finally shown up to help clear out the house, snickered from the doorway. Take them to your rat hole apartment. If you want them so badly, add them to your loser collection. Something in me snapped. All the grief, exhaustion, and resentment of the past months boiled over. I lunged forward, grabbing the box from Dad's hands. This was his soul. I shouted, my voice breaking. These meant everything to him, and you're throwing them away like trash. Dad stepped back, startled by my outburst. Kyle rolled his eyes, but I didn't care. I hugged the box to my chest, shaking with rage and grief, and backed toward the door. Take them, Dad muttered, looking uncomfortable. One less thing to haul to the curb. I didn't say goodbye. I just carried that heavy box on my handlebars all the way back to my apartment above the pizzeria. Tears blurred my vision the entire ride. That night, I sat on my bed surrounded by Gramps' comics, carefully removing each one from the box. Some were in protective sleeves, others just carefully preserved through decades of gentle handling. Each one felt like a piece of him, his fingerprints, his care, his love of stories imprinted on every page. I remembered him telling me about many of these issues. The first appearance of Black Panther, the death of Gwen Stacy, the original Crisis on Infinite Earths. Each comic was a memory, a conversation, a Sunday afternoon on his porch. Around midnight, I took a break and mindlessly scrolled through YouTube on my phone, looking for something to distract me from my grief. An algorithm-suggested video caught my eye. $1 Million Comic Finds. Ordinary people who struck gold. I clicked on it, not really expecting anything relevant. The video featured collectors discussing rare comics that had been discovered in attics, at yard sales, or in forgotten collections. The host was explaining how first appearance issues or rare misprints could be worth staggering amounts. The Holy Grail, of course, is Action Comics #1 from 1938. The collector on screen explained. The first appearance of Superman. One sold last year for just over $6 million. I almost dropped my phone. Gramps had mentioned his father buying the first Superman comic when it came out, but I'd always assumed it was just a tall tale, the kind of story that gets embellished over decades of retelling. With renewed interest, I returned to the box and started digging deeper. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of 1970s X-Men issues, I found a comic in a yellow plastic sleeve that looked older than the others. My hands trembled as I carefully lifted it out. The cover was iconic, Superman lifting a car over his head, people running in panic. At the top, Action Comics #1. June 1938. My heart nearly stopped. This couldn't be real. It had to be a reprint, a reproduction. But the paper felt old, the colors slightly faded in that particular way that happens to vintage ink over decades, not the crisp reproduction quality of modern reprints. I remembered Gramps mentioning once that his father had bought some of the early Superman comics off the newsstand as a kid and kept them. Dad gave them to me when I was 10, he'd said. Told me to take care of them because they were special. Back then, nobody thought comics would be worth anything someday. With shaking hands, I took photos of the comic from various angles and spent the next hour researching authentication methods online. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that this might actually be genuine. According to several collector sites, a near-mint Action Comics #1 had indeed sold for $6.1 million in 2023. Even in poor condition, they were worth hundreds of thousands. Holy H, I caught myself, though there was no one to hear me in my tiny apartment. Gramps, did you leave me a jackpot without even knowing it? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense that Gramps wouldn't have known its true value. He collected comics for love, not money. He didn't follow auction sites or keep track of record sales. To him, these were treasured stories, mementos of his childhood and his connection with his father, not investments. I carefully placed the comic back in its sleeve, my mind racing. If this was real, a genuine Action Comics #1, it could change everything. College wouldn't be a distant dream. I could quit my 3 exhausting jobs. I could build the life Gramps had always wanted for me. But what if it was fake? What if it was just a good reproduction, and I was getting my hopes up for nothing? If this is a fake, I'll have to sell a kidney to pay off my student loans, I said to the empty room, laughing nervously. The possibility felt both absurd and terrifyingly real. I remembered something Gramps had told me once while showing me his collection. The real treasure isn't what these might be worth someday, Jake. It's what you choose to protect and preserve that matters. Now I wondered if he'd understood the double meaning in his own words. Had he known what was in that box? Had he intentionally never mentioned the Action Comics #1 to my dad, knowing it would be sold off immediately? I couldn't sleep that night. I kept getting up to check that the comic was still there, still real. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to know for sure, and that meant getting the comic authenticated by experts. The nearest reputable comic authentication service was in Cleveland, about an hour away. I requested 2 days off from all my jobs, claiming a family emergency, which was entirely untrue. This was about Gramps. After all, I researched how to properly transport valuable comics, wrapped the Action Comics #1 in acid-free paper, placed it between 2 pieces of cardboard, and secured it in a waterproof bag. The comic never left my sight, not even when I used the bathroom at the bus station. Sitting on that Greyhound to Cleveland, with potentially millions of dollars in my backpack, I felt like I was living in one of Gramps' superhero stories. Hope and fear battled in my chest as the Ohio countryside rolled by outside the window. "This is my chance, Gramps," I whispered, clutching my backpack. "I just hope you meant for me to find this." The Cleveland Comic Authentication Service was housed in a nondescript office building that could have been an accounting firm from the outside. Inside, though, was a different story. Glass display cases featured rare comics, vintage action figures, and movie memorabilia that made my inner 10-year-old geek out completely. I approached the counter nervously, my backpack clutched against my chest like it contained the nuclear codes rather than an old comic book. "I have something I'd like authenticated," I explained to the woman behind the counter, trying to sound casual and probably failing miserably. She nodded, completely unimpressed. They probably got people like me every day. Hopeful nobodies convinced they'd found treasure in Grandma's attic. I carefully unpacked my precious cargo, removing the acid-free paper with trembling fingers. The moment I placed Gramps' Action Comics #1 on the counter, everything changed. The woman's professional detachment evaporated. Her eyes widened, and she called over her shoulder, "Mark, you need to see this. Now." A balding man with thick glasses emerged from a back room, took one look at the comic, and froze mid-step. "May I?" he asked, already pulling on white cotton gloves. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. They examined the comic with the reverence of priests handling a sacred text. Special lights were brought out, magnifying glasses, digital cameras. After what felt like hours, Mark looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. This appears to be an authentic Action Comics #1 from 1938, he said carefully. The first appearance of Superman, and it's in remarkable condition for its age. Near mint, I'd say. Where did you get this? My grandfather, I managed to say, he passed away recently. Mark nodded thoughtfully. Did he have any idea what he had here? I shook my head. I don't think so. He just loved comics. Well, Mark said, removing his glasses to clean them, what you have here is worth approximately $5 to $7 million at current market value, possibly more at auction, given the provenance and condition. I must have swayed on my feet, because the woman quickly pushed a chair behind me. Maybe you should sit down, she suggested. That would be a good idea. I agreed weakly, collapsing into the chair. You're sure it's real? Mark nodded. We'll need to do some further testing for a complete authentication certificate, but I've been doing this for 30 years. It's real, and it's one of the finest examples I've ever seen. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, insurance arrangements, and discussions about auction houses. They recommended a prestigious auction house in New York that specialized in rare comics and memorabilia. They'll take about 15% commission, Mark explained, but they'll get you top dollar, handle all the security and advertising, and they have the best pool of serious buyers. I left Cleveland with security escort and a signed authentication certificate that officially declared Graham's comic to be worth more money than I could comprehend. The bus ride back to Ravenna felt surreal. Nothing had changed outside, but everything had changed inside me. The next week passed in a whirlwind. I flew to New York, my first time on a plane, with the comic secured in a special case handcuffed to a courier. The auction house people treated me like royalty once they verified what I had. They put me up in a hotel where the shower was bigger than my entire apartment bathroom, and the windows had a view of Central Park. The auction was scheduled for Saturday evening, a special event featuring extraordinary comic treasures. My Action Comics #1 was a headline item, prominently featured in the catalog with a detailed provenance, explaining how it had passed from my great-grandfather to Gramps to me. The auction room looked like something from a movie, with chandelier lighting and plush seating. Important-looking people in expensive suits mingled, while white-gloved attendants carried trays of champagne. I felt ridiculously out of place in my one decent shirt and department store slacks. I was seated in the front row, next to the auctioneer's podium. As the room filled, a representative from the auction house sat beside me to explain the process. Don't be nervous, she said, misreading my wide-eyed staring as anxiety. The bidding will move quickly. We have several serious buyers here in person, plus telephone and online bidders from around the world. The auction began with some lesser items, still valuable comics, but nothing approaching the value of mine. When they finally brought out the Action Comics #1, displayed in a special lit case, a hush fell over the room. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the speakers. Lot 42, Action Comics #1, June 1938. The first appearance of Superman. Near mint condition. We'll start the bidding at $3 million. A paddle went up immediately. Then another, and another. $4 million, $5 million, $6 million. The numbers climbed so quickly I could barely process what was happening. These people were tossing around millions like I debated spending an extra dollar on coffee. $6,500,000. The auctioneer called. Do I hear 7? The room went silent. After a tense moment. Sold for $6,500,000 to bidder number 19. Just like that, Graham's comic, the one my dad had been ready to throw in the trash, had sold for $6.5 million. After the auction house's commission and federal taxes, I would walk away with approximately $4.3 million. I was a millionaire. Me, Jake Martin, who couldn't afford community college 3 weeks ago. Back in my hotel room that night, I couldn't sleep. The enormity of what had happened wouldn't let my brain rest. I kept thinking about Gramps, wondering if he had any idea what he'd left me. Part of me felt guilty, like I'd won the lottery on the back of his death. I could almost hear his voice. Money changes things, Jake. Make sure it doesn't change you. That thought stuck with me as I flew back to Ohio. A cashier's check for more money than I'd ever imagined tucked safely in my pocket. By the time the plane landed, I had made some decisions. First, I wasn't going to tell my parents or Kyle about the money right away. They'd thrown away Gramps comics without a second thought. They didn't deserve to benefit from what they considered trash. Second, I was going to honor Gramps with what I did with the money. Half would go toward my future, college, a modest house, investments for security. The other half would go toward creating something that would have made him proud. Over the next few months, I put my plan into action. I bought a small but charming Victorian house in Ravenna with a spacious front porch perfect for reading comics on summer afternoons. I applied and was accepted to the Cleveland Institute of Arts Graphic Design and Illustration program. And most importantly, I found a vacant storefront on Main Street, just 2 blocks from where Gramps used to take me for ice cream after comic shopping. Grandpa's Comics opened 6 months after the auction. The shop was everything I had dreamed of as a kid: warm wooden shelves filled with carefully organized comics from every era, comfortable reading nooks with beanbag chairs, a small cafe area serving hot chocolate and cookies. The walls featured enlarged panels from classic comics, and a special glass case displayed some of the rare issues from Gramps' collection that I kept rather than selling. The grand opening attracted people from all over northeastern Ohio. Collectors marvel at my selection, which ranged from Golden Age Captain America to the latest Deadpool. Kids pressed their noses against the glass cases, pointing at colorful covers and arguing about which superhero could beat which. My business model was simple but sustainable. The mainstream comics and merchandise kept the bills paid, while the occasional sale of a rare issue from Gramps' box provided extra income. I wasn't going to get rich from the shop, but that wasn't the point. It was a tribute, not a cash cow. As the months passed, Grandpa's Comics became more than just a store. It became a community space. I started a weekly reading program for kids from the local children's home, where they could come and read whatever comics they wanted in a safe, welcoming environment. Every child got to choose one comic to take home each month, free of charge. During one of these sessions, a small boy with serious eyes and a Spider-Man t-shirt too big for his skinny frame tugged at my sleeve. "Do you have Superman #1? He asked earnestly. I couldn't help but smile. "Had one once," I told him, "but it went to good cause." The boy nodded like this made perfect sense, then returned to his beanbag chair with the latest Miles Morales issue. I often thought about what Gramps would say if he could see what his comics had created. The store that bore his nickname. The scholarship fund I'd established at the local high school for art students. The kids who found escape and inspiration between illustrated pages, just like I had. One evening after closing, as I was straightening shelves and restocking the new releases, I remembered something Gramps had told me during one of our Sunday reading sessions. "Money is just paper, Jake," he'd said, carefully sliding an X-Men comic into his protective sleeve. "The real treasure is what you give away. That comes back to you tenfold." At the time, I'd thought he was just being philosophical. Now I understood what he meant on a bone-deep level. The joy I felt watching a shy kid come out of their shell while discussing Batman's gadgets, or seeing a stressed parent relax with a comic and hot chocolate while their child explored the kids' section, that was worth more than any auction price. The Cleveland newspaper ran a feature on me about a year after I opened the shop. "Comic Inheritance Creates Community Haven." The headline read. The article told the story of Gramps' comic, the auction, and what I'd done with the money. They interviewed some of the regular customers and kids from the reading program. It was a flattering piece, focusing on the community aspect rather than the money. I was sitting at the counter sketching ideas for my own comic series, a project for school that had grown into something I was genuinely passionate about, when the bell over the door jingled. Without looking up, I called out my usual greeting. "Welcome to Grandpa's Comics. Let me know if you need help finding anything." When no one responded, I glanced up from my drawing. My pencil froze mid-stroke. Standing just inside the doorway were my father and Kyle. Dad looked older than when I'd last seen him at Gramps' house. There were new lines around his eyes, and his hair had more gray. Kyle hadn't changed much. Still athletic, still carrying himself with that arrogant swagger that had always made me feel small. The silence stretched uncomfortably. A few customers browsing the shelves sensed attention and discreetly moved toward the back of the store. Nice place. Dad finally said, his eyes taking in the shop. Saw the article in the paper. I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. It had been over a year since I'd seen either of them, despite living in the same town. Kyle picked up a Batman action figure from a display, turning it over in his hands. So you're rich now, huh? All from that old comic book Dad was going to throw out. There was the real reason for their visit. I should have known they wouldn't stay away once the story got out. Dad shot Kyle a warning look, then turned back to me with what I assumed was meant to be a conciliatory smile. We were hoping we could talk, he said, taking a step toward the counter. Privately, I glanced around at my shop, my creation, my tribute to Gramps, the physical manifestation of everything he'd taught me about stories and heroes and standing up for what matters. Then I looked back at the two men who had never seen me, never valued me, until I had something they wanted. A familiar coldness settled in my stomach, but now it was accompanied by something new, a calm certainty about who I was and what I stood for. Whatever you want to say, I replied, setting down my pencil. You can say it right here. Their expressions hardened, and I knew instantly that the pleasant facade was about to crack. The peace I'd found was coming to an end, but this time, I wasn't the same powerless kid I'd been a year ago. This time, I had more than just comics to defend. Dad took another step toward me, lowering his voice despite the now empty shop. The last customer had slipped out during our standoff, the bell above the door jingling awkwardly on their exit. Jake, be reasonable, Dad said, adopting the same tone he'd used when explaining why Kyle deserted a car while I got nothing. That comic was part of your grandfather's estate. It should have been divided fairly among the family. Kyle nodded vigorously. You basically stole our inheritance, bro. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The absolute audacity was almost impressive. Inheritance? You called it junk. You were literally throwing it in the trash when I took it. Dad's face reddened. I'm still Fred's son. That was a family heirloom you had no right to sell without consulting us. No right? My voice rose despite my attempt to stay calm. You told me to take the comics because they were one less thing to haul to the curb. Those exact words, Dad. Kyle stepped forward, his former football player frame physically imposing in the narrow space between comic displays. Look, we're not here to argue about who said what. That comic belonged to Grandpa, which means it was part of his estate, which means Dad had legal rights to it. You owe us our share. I stared at them, these two men who had dismissed me my entire life, who had thrown away Gramps' precious collection without a thought, who hadn't even bothered to check on me in over a year. Now here they were, hands out, feeling entitled to money they'd done nothing to earn. Get out of my store, I said quietly. Jake, Dad started. Get out now. They left, but the confrontation wasn't over. 2 weeks later, I was served with legal papers. My father was suing me for a portion of the Action Comics #1 proceeds, claiming that as grandson and heir to house contents, the valuable comic should have been part of his inheritance. I hired a lawyer, one of the best in northeastern Ohio, with part of my auction money. Her name was Elaine Chun, and she was known for handling high-profile inheritance disputes. After reviewing my case, she seemed almost amused. They literally threw the comics away? She asked, making notes. And told you to take them? I nodded. There were witnesses, too. Kyle was there, and Mom was in the next room. Ms. Chun smiled thinly. This should be interesting. The legal process dragged on for months. Depositions were taken. Mom reluctantly testified that yes, Dad had told me to take the comics. Kyle tried to claim I had somehow tricked him, that I'd known the comic was valuable all along. The judge was a stern older woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She listened to both sides with practice and passivity, occasionally asking a clarifying question that revealed she was following the case closely. The trial itself lasted only 2 days. Ms. Chum methodically presented evidence that the comics had been abandoned property, that I had taken them with permission, and that my father had explicitly rejected them as junk. She even found precedent in similar cases where discarded items later discovered to be valuable remained the property of the person who had salvaged them. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Case dismissed. The plaintiff not only abandoned the property in question, but explicitly encouraged the defendant to take possession of it. The judge stated, "The subsequent discovery of its value does not retroactively change the nature of that transaction. The comic book and proceeds from its sale belong solely to the defendant." Dad and Kyle stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me. Mom lingered for a moment, her expression unreadable, then followed them. Ms. Chin shook my hand. "Congratulations." Not that there was much doubt, but it's good to have legal closure. I felt relief, but not the triumph I'd expected. Winning a lawsuit against my own family wasn't exactly something to celebrate. The next year passed peacefully. The shop thrived. I completed my first year of art school with honors. The newspaper article and subsequent lawsuit had actually increased business. Nothing draws attention like drama. I expanded the reading program to twice weekly and started a scholarship for young artists interested in comic book illustration. Life settled into a new normal that I could never have imagined back when I was pumping gas and cleaning floors. I thought about Gramps every day, especially when sitting on my porch with a comic and a cold drink, just like we used to do at his house. The lawsuit had effectively ended any relationship with my family. I'd see them occasionally around town. Ravenna wasn't that big, but we'd pretend not to notice each other. Kyle finished college and moved to Columbus for a job. Dad and Mom continued their lives as if I didn't exist, until one Tuesday afternoon, almost 2 years after the court case. The bell above the shop door jingled, and I looked up from restocking the new releases to see my father standing awkwardly by the entrance, hands shoved in his jacket pockets. He looked older, more diminished somehow. "Hey, Jake," he said quietly. "Got a minute?" My first instinct was to tell him to leave, but something in his expression stopped me. He wasn't here to fight. "Shop's empty right now." I replied cautiously. "Say what you need to say." Dad walked slowly toward the counter, taking in the store as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on a wall display featuring some of Gramps' original artwork, sketches he'd done in the margins of his comics that I'd had professionally framed. "Your grandfather was talented," he said. I never really looked at his drawings before. There were a lot of things about Gramps you never bothered to see. I replied, more bitterness in my voice than I'd intended. Dad nodded, accepting the jab. "I know. I was blind to a lot of things, Jake, including you." He took a deep breath, running his hand through his thinning hair. "I've had a lot of time to think since everything. Kyle moved out. Your mom and I, we're not doing so great. And I keep coming back to where I went wrong." I remained silent, waiting. I put everything into Kyle because he was easy for me to understand. Football, athletics, that was my world. You were always more like Dad, creative, thoughtful. I didn't know how to connect with that, so I just didn't try. This unexpected vulnerability from my always stoic father left me momentarily speechless. Kyle was my ego, my pride. He continued, "But you were my heart, Jake, and I was too stupid to see it until it was too late. Part of me wanted to embrace this olive branch, to finally have a father I'd always wanted. Another part remembered years of neglect, of being the afterthought, of having to fight for every scrap of attention or support. Gramps taught me something important. I finally said, forgiveness doesn't erase the scars. It just means you're choosing to move forward despite them." I reached under the counter and pulled out a carefully bagged and boarded comic. Superman number 75, the famous Death of Superman issue. Not particularly valuable, but symbolically significant. "Here," I said, handing it to him. "Read it sometime. Maybe you'll understand a few things." Dad took the comic carefully, treating it with a reverence he'd never shown before. "Thank you, Jake. I'm not saying we're suddenly going to be best buddies," I added, "but maybe we can start somewhere new." He nodded, understanding the limited nature of my forgiveness. That's more than I deserve. Dad came by the shop occasionally after that, usually during slow periods. We never became close, too much water under that bridge, but we established a civil relationship. He even helped out during a store-wide sale, surprising me with his gentle handling of the comics and patience with enthusiastic kids. Kyle never came around. Last I heard, He was working for a sporting goods company in Columbus, still living in the past glory of his football days. Some chapters just don't get a resolution, and I was okay with that. By my 23rd birthday, Grandpa's Comics had become a local landmark. I'd expanded into the vacant space next door, adding a dedicated area for workshops and drawing classes. My own comic series, The Collector, featuring a protagonist suspiciously similar to Gramps, had been picked up by an independent publisher and was developing a loyal following. The shop was packed most weekends with a mix of serious collectors arguing about whether the 1970s X-Men run was overrated, kids sprawled on beanbag chairs lost in magical worlds, and parents rediscovering titles from their own childhoods. I'd established a substantial annual donation to the local children's home, not just comics, but art supplies, educational materials, and a summer camp program where professional artists taught the kids how to create their own stories. Gramps would say heroes always share their treasure. I told a reporter who covered the program for the local paper. It wasn't just a nice quote. I genuinely believed it. The real value of what I'd inherited wasn't the money. It was a chance to create something meaningful. One Saturday afternoon, a small boy in a Batman t-shirt tugged at my sleeve while I was straightening a display. "Are you Batman?" he asked with complete seriousness, his eyes wide behind tiny glasses. I laughed. "No, but my grandfather was cooler than Alfred." The boy considered this deeply, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. "Can I be Batman when I grow up?" "You can be whoever you want to be," I told him, remembering how Gramps had encouraged my own dreams when the rest of the world seemed determined to shrink them. That evening after closing, I sat on my porch watching the sunset, a habit I'd picked up from Gramps. In my hands was a reprint of Action Comics #1. I'd sold the original, but kept this affordable reproduction as a reminder of where it all began. The past 5 years have been a journey I could never have predicted. That night I ran from my parents' dinner table, heart burning with the determination to prove myself. I'd lost Gramps, found a fortune, built a business, fought a lawsuit, and slowly, painfully, constructed an identity separate from the shadow of my brother. Through it all, Gramps' wisdom had guided me. "A hero isn't the one who wins," he used to say. "A hero is the one who stays true to themselves no matter what." I tried to live by those words, to honor his memory not just with the shop that bore his nickname, but with the choices I made every day, using my unexpected wealth to create opportunities for others, finding meaning in stories and art, building a kind of community where a skinny, comic-obsessed kid would feel valued, not overlooked. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that even the most talented comic book colorist would envy. In the growing darkness, I could almost feel Gramps sitting beside me, turning pages of Fantastic Four issue, pointing out Jack Kirby's distinctive artwork. "Life is a comic book, Jake." I could hear him say, "Some parts are action-packed. Some are quiet reflection. Some panels show your darkest moments, others your greatest triumphs. But you're the one drawing your story, panel by panel, page by page. Make it vibrant." I smiled into the twilight, a profound sense of peace settling over me. "Thanks, Gramps," I whispered. "I'm working on creating the best issue yet." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I made a silent promise to myself and to him to keep drawing my story with the same courage, creativity, and heart that he'd shown me was possible. In the end, that was the real inheritance he'd left me. Not a valuable comic book, but a wisdom to create a life as colorful and meaningful as the stories we'd shared. The multicolored lights from the shop sign cast a warm glow across the porch as night settled in. Tomorrow would bring another day of comics and customers, stories and sharing. My story wasn't finished. In many ways, it was just beginning, but thanks to a box of supposedly worthless comics and a grandfather who saw value where others saw junk, I had all the tools I needed to make it a masterpiece. I carefully placed the Action Comics reprint back in its protective sleeve. Superman's iconic pose on the cover, lifting a car over his head, saving the day, reminded me of everything Gramps had taught me about heroism. It wasn't about super strength or flying or fancy gadgets. It was about standing up when it mattered, protecting what was precious, and using whatever powers you had to make the world a little better. In that way, perhaps Gramps had been the real superhero all along.